get tired of that.
Following the horrific school shooting last month in Parkland, Florida, wherein a high school student tragically murdered 17 people, the conversation regarding violence in video games has re-emerged, and justifiably so. For those who operate outside of the gaming industry and have little to no experience with the medium, video games are an easy scapegoat for America's frequent mass murders. After all, terms such as simulations, game worlds, immersive experiences, and realistic graphics have long been part of the public vocabulary we use when discussing video games and the interactive medium they define. I think when we couple these popular phrases alongside depictions of violence in games, people get scared.
Because a lot of bad things are happening to young kids and young minds, and their minds are being formed. And we have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it. And also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
President Donald Trump hosted a meeting in early March with partisans from both extremes of the violent video games debate to sit down and discuss how the online sales of violent video games are shaping the young minds of America. Trump was joined by a handful of representatives from both sides of the issue, including executives from the Entertainment Software Association, ESRB Ratings Board, Take-Two Interactive, Bethesda Softworks, and the Parents Television Council, the latter of which is a massive proponent of criminalizing the sale of violent video games to kids. During the meeting, the Trump administration demoed a highlight reel of violence in video games, which featured clips from Modern Warfare 2, Sniper Elite 4, Fallout, and Dead by Daylight, and a few other games, all of which lacked any sort of context or nuance that's associated with many of the moments featured in the video. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2's No Russian mission, which centers around a mass shooting at an international airport, is actually completely skippable. Before starting the controversial level, the game warns its players of disturbing content and offers the chance to skip the experience entirely, moving right along in the story campaign. Those of us who chose to play the airport segment were given a LMG and were met with the option to enact uncomfortable, excessive, and grotesque on-screen violence. And personally, I think that's okay. No Russian adds a weight to the enemies in Modern Warfare 2 and completely retextualizes the war that's being fought by the player. Back when I first played it, the developers of the game, Infinity Ward, completely flipped the switch and forced me to reflect on the death, war, and grotesque violence I was responsible for, as No Russian shined a light on a part of my character that I was uncomfortable with, and forced me to wrestle with my actions as a player. It made me feel sick to my stomach. Call of Duty did exactly what good art does. It triggered an emotional response. While President Trump's meeting was more focused on gathering information on the subject of violence in games, he did acknowledge that studies have found that there's a correlation between virtual violence and real violence, which is actually not true. In fact, science has proven the opposite. In a recent interview with Waypoint's Patrick Klepek, Villanova University professor of psychology Patrick Markey sat down to discuss how his team's many years of research points to the fact that video game violence does not correlate to real-life violence.
The vast majority of scholars don't think they pose societal harm. The group that tends to think that violent video games have a negative effect typically examine kind of very mundane measures of regression, like giving too much hot sauce to a person or exposing someone to an irritating noise. And in that kind of research, we do find that after a person plays a violent video game, immediately afterward, they kind of display these kind of, if you will, jerky qualities. Whereas the other group of researchers, we more examine horrific acts of violence, like actual homicides and aggravated assaults and things of that sort. And in that research, we actually don't find a link, or we actually find the link goes in the opposite direction. It's almost like going to a movie. If you go and see a really sad movie, you're probably going to cry right afterward. You're going to feel sad about it. Your mood's going to change. But it's not going to make you clinically depressed suddenly. So just like video games might alter our moods temporarily, they're not fundamentally changing us as individuals.
I certainly agree that the violence depicted in video games is sometimes excessive and is even horrific in some cases, but it's not something that we need to be afraid of, even when it's devoid of context. Trump remarked that kids shouldn't be exposed to excessive violence, something that I think many of us probably agree with. However, it should be known that the gaming industry has several safeguards in place to prevent this very thing. The Entertainment Software Rating Board, otherwise known as the ESRB, assigns age and content ratings for video games which indicate whether or not a particular collection of content is appropriate for a certain age group. On top of that, the board enforces video game advertising guidelines and helps to ensure publishers and developers maintain responsible privacy practices in their operations. Ultimately, I'd argue that keeping underage children from playing violent video games is a responsibility that falls almost exclusively on parents. Publishers and video game platform holders have even equipped them with parental controls, which is a valuable tool that can help prevent children and minors from experiencing inappropriate content when parents aren't around. I've talked a lot about video games and violence in this video, and I want any viewers who may not be familiar with the world of video games to know that the medium is an incredibly versatile one. Many game developers in both the AAA and independent game development scene have shifted their focus to designing experiences that minimize or completely exclude violence. Regardless, beauty and horror both possess merit and often exist within the same space, and they can even work together to uncover truth or catharsis. The interactive and varied nature of this medium allow us a glimpse into the window of worlds, ideas, and lifestyles that we will never be able to feel or experience outside of a virtual space. Video games are capable of demonstrating a plethora of themes, feelings, and ideas. Sure, there are some games that might employ or even glorify violence. However, there are countless others that elevate pacifism, discovery, and beauty. And while our industry has things to figure out for sure, I'd argue that they aren't related to America's problem with gun violence. Rather, I'd say the problem is our nation's collective lack of compassion, empathy, and social justice, and the irresponsibility of our government's legislative priorities aren't doing us any favors.